The crimson liquid stained the ceremonial fabric like an open wound. She collapsed among the glittering fragments while hundreds of wild gazes witnessed her disgrace in the year's most important ritual. Yet she did not know that the most feared leader had traveled great distances for the sole purpose of meeting her. The crimson wine spread across the sacred tapestry like spilled blood, each drop a testament to Serena's humiliation as 300 pairs of eyes bore into her trembling form. The silence that followed her spectacular fall down the marble steps of the Grand Hall seemed to stretch into eternity, broken only by the soft rustle of her torn dress and the barely contained snickers echoing from the crowd of elegantly dressed females who had witnessed her disgrace. She had dreamed of this moment for months, practicing her walk in the privacy of her small quarters above the archives, imagining how she might glide gracefully down those steps like the other candidates. Instead, she lay sprawled at the bottom of the ceremonial staircase, her borrowed dress ripped at the seam, revealing far more than was appropriate for the most sacred ceremony of their kind. The ancient goblet that had held the ceremonial wine now lay shattered beside her, its contents seeping into the threads of the tapestry that had been blessed by lunar ceremonies for over 2 centuries. The choosing was the most important night of the year for their pack, when unmated females presented themselves to the Alpha Supreme, hoping to catch his attention and secure their future as Luna. Serena had never expected to be chosen, but pack law required all eligible females to participate, regardless of their social standing or personal desires. As the pack's head librarian and keeper of historical records, she had spent her days surrounded by dusty tomes and forgotten prophecies, far from the political maneuvering and social climbing that dominated pack life. At 26, she was considered past her prime by pack standards, her quiet nature and scholarly interests making her invisible to most of the powerful males who sought dynamic, socially connected mates. Her role in the archives was deliberately chosen to avoid the spotlight, allowing her to observe the intricate dynamics of pack politics while remaining safely on the periphery. She had always been more comfortable with ancient texts than contemporary conversations, finding solace in the stories of past Lunas who had shaped their history through wisdom rather than manipulation. Her naturally observant personality had allowed her to notice patterns that others missed, from subtle shifts in pack alliances to inconsistencies in genealogical records that she meticulously maintained. This attention to detail often put her at odds with established traditions, especially when her research revealed uncomfortable truths about their supposedly pure bloodlines. Her greatest internal conflict lay in the constant struggle between her desire for acceptance and her need for authenticity, particularly when she discovered that many traditions followed blindly by the pack seemed disconnected from their original values. The laughter grew louder now, and she could hear whispered comments about her clumsiness, her inappropriate dress, her obvious lack of grace. Isabella Ravencrest, the pack's golden daughter and expected choice for Luna, stood halfway down the stairs in her pristine silver gown, a perfectly crafted smile playing on her lips as she watched Serena's humiliation unfold. Isabella had been groomed for this role since childhood, her family's influence and her own political acumen, making her the obvious choice for any rational alpha. "How mortifying," came a voice from the crowd, followed by another. "Poor thing, she never had a chance anyway." Serena felt tears threatening to spill as she struggled to gather the torn fabric of her dress, trying to preserve some semblance of dignity while the entire pack witnessed her failure. The ceremonial wine had stained not only the sacred tapestry, but also her hands, creating the appearance that she had been marked by her own shame. She could feel the weight of generations of successful Lunas judging her from the painted portraits that lined the walls, their serene faces a stark contrast to her current state of disgrace. But as she prepared to flee from the hall and disappear into the safety of her beloved archives, footsteps echoed against the marble floor. The crowd's laughter died instantly, replaced by a tense silence that made her skin prickle with awareness. She looked up through her disheveled hair to see polished black boots approaching, their owner's presence so commanding that the very air seemed to thicken around him. Alpha Supreme Darius Blackthorn stood before her, his imposing figure casting a shadow that seemed to embrace rather than intimidate her. His reputation for cold leadership and ruthless decision-making had made him both feared and respected throughout their territory. Yet as he extended his hand to help her rise, there was an unexpected gentleness in the gesture that contrasted sharply with everything she had heard about him. His golden eyes, the mark of true alpha blood, fixed on hers with an intensity that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. When their skin touched, she felt a jolt of electricity that seemed to awaken something dormant within her, a recognition that she couldn't understand but couldn't deny. He pulled her to her feet with careful strength, his large hand engulfing hers in warmth that spread up her arm and settled somewhere deep in her chest. "You're bleeding," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearby. Indeed, her palm had been cut by a shard of the broken goblet, thin lines of blood mixing with the wine stains on her skin. Without hesitation, he pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and gently wrapped it around her injured hand, his touch surprisingly tender for someone with such a fearsome reputation. The crowd watched in stunned silence as their alpha, who had never shown public concern for anyone's welfare, tended to the pack's most overlooked member with the kind of attention usually reserved for matters of territorial defense. Isabella's perfect composure cracked slightly, her blue eyes narrowing as she witnessed this unexpected development. The other candidates stood frozen on the stairs, their carefully planned presentations forgotten in the face of this unprecedented scene. "I choose her," Darius announced, his voice carrying clearly through the vast hall, each word falling like a stone into still water. The declaration sent shockwaves through the assembled pack, gasps and murmurs rising like a tide of disbelief. "Serena Matthews will be my Luna." The words hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her legs weak. She stared up at him in complete shock, certain she had misheard, but the satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth confirmed the impossible truth. The Alpha Supreme, who could have chosen any female in their territory, had selected the clumsy librarian who had just humiliated herself in front of everyone. Isabella's carefully controlled mask slipped entirely, revealing a flash of rage so intense that several pack members took instinctive steps backward. Her family's political connections and her own years of preparation had led everyone, including herself, to expect this moment would crown her as Luna. Instead, she watched in horror as their alpha claimed a nobody, a quiet scholar with no social standing or influential bloodline to recommend her. "This is unacceptable," Elder Blackwood's voice boomed from the high table where the pack's governing council sat in their ceremonial robes. His weathered face was flushed with indignation, his ancient eyes blazing with disapproval. The Luna must be chosen from approved bloodlines, from females who have been properly prepared for the role. This is unprecedented. Other voices joined the protest, creating a cacophony of objections that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Grand Hall. Serena felt overwhelmed by the chaos surrounding her, by the responsibility suddenly thrust upon her shoulders, by the implications of a choice that would change not only her life, but potentially the entire structure of their society. Darius raised his hand for silence, and the room immediately quieted, testament to the absolute authority he wielded over their pack. "The choice has been made," he stated with finality that brooked no argument. "The bonding ceremony will take place at the next full moon." As the crowd began to disperse in clusters of animated conversation, Serena found herself alone with the man who had just turned her world upside down. The grand hall, which moments before had been filled with hundreds of witnesses to her humiliation, now felt intimate and overwhelming in its vastness. "Why?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. "Why me?" Darius studied her face for a long moment, his golden eyes seeming to see straight through to her soul. "Because," he said quietly, "you're the only one who doesn't want this power for yourself." His words sent a chill through her as she realized the truth in them. While every other female in the pack had spent years positioning themselves for this opportunity, dreaming of the influence and status that came with being Luna, she had never harbored such ambitions. Her desires had always been simpler: to preserve their history, to understand their traditions, to find her place in a world that often seemed to have no room for quiet souls like hers. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch. Behind the cold authority and calculated control, she glimpsed a loneliness that mirrored her own, a burden of leadership that had isolated him from genuine connection. Perhaps his choice hadn't been as impulsive as it appeared. Perhaps he had been watching her just as carefully as she had been observing the pack dynamics from her position in the archives. The weeks that followed blurred together in a whirlwind of preparation, protocol lessons, and barely concealed hostility from those who felt she had stolen a position that rightfully belonged to someone else. Isabella and her supporters made their displeasure known through subtle slights and social exclusion, while the Elder Council subjected her to grueling sessions designed to test her knowledge of lunar traditions and responsibilities. During this time, she began to notice changes in herself that she couldn't explain. Her senses seemed sharper, her intuition more accurate, and strangest of all, she found she could ease the pain of injured pack members simply by touching them. When young Marcus twisted his ankle during training, her instinctive gesture of comfort had resulted in rapid healing that left both of them staring in wonder at her unmarked skin where his pain had been. These manifestations of power both thrilled and terrified her, especially when she began finding references in the old text to lunar bloodlines that had possessed similar abilities. Her research took on new urgency as she searched for explanations, diving deeper into genealogical records that she had maintained for years without fully understanding their significance. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that she made the discovery that would change everything. Hidden in the binding of a centuries-old tome, she found a document that made her blood run cold. Her own lineage, carefully traced through records she had thought were merely administrative, revealed connections to a line of legendary Lunars who had been deliberately erased from official pack history. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Her adoption as an infant, which she had always attributed to unfortunate circumstances, appeared to have been carefully orchestrated. The families who had raised her, the education she had received, even her position in the archives, seemed to have been designed to prepare her for this moment while keeping her unaware of her true heritage. But why had this bloodline been hidden? And what had happened to the other Lunars whose names had been systematically removed from the official records? As she traced the genealogical threads deeper into their pack's history, she began to uncover a pattern of suppression that suggested her predecessors had possessed abilities that made certain members of the pack very uncomfortable. The revelation that her entire life had been shaped by forces she hadn't understood filled her with a mixture of anger and betrayal. The people she had trusted, the historians who had taught her, even the pack leadership, had all been part of an elaborate deception designed to keep her ignorant of her own power and heritage. As the full moon approached and her bonding ceremony drew near, Serena realized that her humiliation on the ceremonial stairs had been just the beginning of a transformation that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, her pack, and the very nature of power in their supernatural world. The quiet librarian who had stumbled down those marble steps was disappearing, replaced by something far more dangerous and infinitely more powerful. But the question remained, had Darius chosen her because he somehow knew what she was becoming, or had his selection triggered an awakening that had been waiting dormant in her bloodline for generations? Either way, she suspected that what happened on the night of their bonding would change not just her fate, but the destiny of their entire pack in ways that none of them could yet imagine. The bonding ceremony should have been the happiest night of Serena's life, but as she stood in the moonlit clearing, surrounded by hundreds of pack members, she felt like a fraud wearing someone else's destiny. The ancient ritual circle had been carved into the earth by their ancestors centuries ago, its intricate patterns glowing with an otherworldly silver light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her racing heartbeat. Tonight, under the full moon's piercing gaze, she would be bound to Darius not just as his mate, but as the spiritual leader of their entire pack. The traditional lunar robes felt heavy on her shoulders, their midnight blue fabric embroidered with silver threads that formed constellations mapping the phases of the moon. These same robes had been worn by dozens of lunars before her, each one leaving behind an invisible imprint of power and responsibility that she could feel pressing against her skin like whispered expectations. The weight of their legacy threatened to crush her as she wondered if she would prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in her so unexpectedly. Darius stood across from her in the center of the circle, his commanding presence somehow both reassuring and intimidating in the moonlight. His formal ceremonial attire marked him as Alpha Supreme, but it was the way he looked at her that made her breath catch in her throat. There was something in his golden eyes that went beyond political alliance or convenient partnership, something that made her suspect their connection ran deeper than either of them fully understood. Elder Blackwood began the ancient incantations, his voice carrying across the clearing as he called upon the moon goddess to witness their union. The ritual words had been spoken for generations, binding alphas and lunars in partnerships that were meant to strengthen and protect their kind. But as the ceremony progressed, Serena began to feel something stirring within her that had nothing to do with tradition or expectation. The power that had been awakening in her over the past weeks suddenly surged, responding to the moon's influence and the sacred nature of the ceremony. She could feel it flowing through her veins like liquid silver, connecting her not just to Darius, but to every member of their pack gathered around the circle. Their emotions, their hopes, their fears, all became as clear to her as if they had spoken them aloud, creating an overwhelming symphony of consciousness that threatened to drown her in its intensity. When Darius took her hand to complete the bonding ritual, the connection between them exploded into something neither had expected. Instead of the simple mate bond that should have formed, she felt their very souls intertwining in a way that ancient texts described but modern wolves had forgotten was possible. Through their joined hands, she could feel his memories, his struggles, his desperate hope that she might be the key to saving their pack from the stagnation that threatened to destroy them from within. But more shocking than the depth of their bond was what she saw in his memories of choosing her. It hadn't been impulse or pity that had guided his decision that night in the Grand Hall. For months, he had been secretly observing her work in the archives, watching how she handled disputes between pack members with natural diplomacy, noting how she instinctively cared for those who were overlooked or marginalized. He had seen in her the qualities that their pack desperately needed in a Luna, even if she couldn't see them in herself. The revelation that her selection had been carefully considered rather than spontaneous should have been comforting, but instead it filled her with a new kind of pressure. If Darius had been watching her so closely, what else had he observed? What expectations did he have for her abilities that she might not be able to meet? As their bond settled into place, she realized that she was no longer just Serena the librarian, but Luna Serena, with all the responsibilities and dangers that the title carried. The ceremony concluded with the traditional presentation to the pack, where she and Darius stood together as their people offered their loyalty and acceptance. Most voices rang out clearly in support, but she couldn't help but notice the silence from certain sections of the gathering, particularly where Isabella and her supporters had positioned themselves. The beautiful blonde's face was a mask of composure, but Serena's newfound sensitivity to emotions allowed her to feel the rage and betrayal radiating from her like heat from a fire. In the days following their bonding, Serena threw herself into learning the complex responsibilities of being Luna, while simultaneously continuing her research into her mysterious bloodline. Her official duties included mediating disputes, overseeing pack welfare programs, and serving as an advisor to Darius on matters affecting their community. Unofficially, she found herself becoming a confidant for pack members who had never felt comfortable approaching previous leadership, particularly the younger wolves and those from less influential families. It was during one of these informal counseling sessions that she made a disturbing discovery. Marcus, the young wolf whose injuries she had healed through instinctive touch, mentioned that his grandmother had always claimed their family descended from Luna bloodlines, despite official records showing them as common pack members. When Serena investigated his genealogy, she found the same pattern of deliberate obfuscation that she had discovered in her own lineage. The implications were staggering. If Marcus's family had been systematically excluded from their rightful heritage, how many others had suffered the same fate? Her research took on new urgency as she began secretly investigating the bloodlines of pack members who had always been relegated to lower social positions despite showing unusual abilities or instincts that suggested noble ancestry. What she found in those dusty records made her blood run cold. Nearly a third of their pack showed evidence of having been deliberately reclassified over the past century, their true lineages hidden beneath layers of falsified documentation. Families that should have held positions of honor and influence had been reduced to servants and laborers, their children growing up ignorant of their royal heritage and the powers that should have been their birthright. The scope of the deception suggested a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of pack leadership, possibly including some of the same elder council members who had questioned her fitness to be Luna. Someone had been systematically suppressing bloodlines for generations, creating an artificial hierarchy that benefited a small group of families while keeping the majority of the pack ignorant of their true potential. But why would anyone want to hide so much power from their own people? As she dug deeper into the historical records, she began to find references to an ancient schism within their pack, a conflict between those who believed in the traditional power structures and those who advocated for a more egalitarian approach to leadership. The winning side had apparently decided that the best way to prevent future challenges to their authority was to ensure that potential rivals never learned about their own capabilities. The discovery filled her with a righteous anger that surprised her with its intensity. These weren't just historical injustices buried in the past. They were ongoing crimes against pack members who deserved to know their true heritage. Children were growing up believing they were nothing special when they carried the blood of ancient Luna and Alpha lineages. Adults were living as servants when they should have been leaders, their gifts suppressed and their potential wasted. Her investigation took an even more personal turn when she found evidence that her own parents, the ones who had died when she was an infant, had been killed rather than lost in the hunting accident that official records claimed. The timing of their deaths, just months after she was born, suggested that someone had discovered her true lineage and decided that the bloodline needed to end with them. Only her age and apparent powerlessness had saved her from sharing their fate. The realization that she was likely an orphan survivor of a deliberate murder plot sent her into a spiral of grief and rage that she struggled to control. The people who had raised her, whom she had always considered her true family, had apparently been chosen not out of love, but as part of a plan to keep her hidden and controllable. Even her position in the archives, which she had thought reflected her natural interests and abilities, had been engineered to keep her buried in the past rather than influencing the present. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the growing suspicion that her selection as Luna might not have been Darius's independent choice after all. If the conspiracy was as extensive as her research suggested, was it possible that even the Alpha Supreme was being manipulated by forces he didn't fully understand? Had her bonding ceremony been orchestrated by the same people who had spent decades suppressing bloodlines and eliminating threats to their power? These dark thoughts consumed her as she struggled to balance her public duties as Luna with her private investigation into pack corruption. She found herself jumping at shadows, wondering if her every move was being watched and reported to unknown enemies. The paranoia began affecting her relationship with Darius, creating a distance between them just when their bond should have been growing stronger. Her fears seemed to be confirmed when she discovered that her mentor, Chief Librarian Aldrich, had been submitting regular reports about her activities to Elder Blackwood. The betrayal cut deeply, destroying her trust in someone she had considered a father figure for most of her adult life. When she confronted him about the reports, his guilt was written clearly across his weathered face, but his explanation only made things worse. "You don't understand the forces at work here, child," he whispered, glancing around nervously, as if afraid they might be overheard even in the privacy of the archives. "There are things about our pack's history that are better left buried. Some bloodlines were suppressed for good reason, powers that were too dangerous to be allowed to manifest unchecked." His words sent a chill through her as she realized that the conspiracy might be even more complex than she had imagined. What if the systematic suppression of certain lineages hadn't been about maintaining political power, but about preventing something catastrophic from being unleashed? What powers had her ancestors possessed that were considered too dangerous for modern wolves to inherit? The questions multiplied in her mind as she considered the implications. If her bloodline carried abilities that previous generations had deemed too risky to allow, what did that mean for her own developing powers? The healing touch, the emotional sensitivity, the strange connection she felt to the moon's phases, were these just the beginning of something far more significant and potentially destructive? Her research took on a desperate quality as she searched for answers about what her ancestors had been capable of, but the more she learned, the more frightened she became. References to lunar bloodlines that could influence weather patterns, communicate with wild creatures, and even manipulate the very fabric of reality itself filled the ancient texts she had once considered merely historical curiosities. If such abilities were real, and if they were manifesting in her, then perhaps the conspiracy to suppress her lineage hadn't been about maintaining political control at all. Perhaps it had been about preventing the emergence of powers that could reshape their entire world, for better or worse. But even as fear crept into her heart, another emotion grew alongside it: determination. Whether her powers were dangerous or not, the pack members who had been denied their heritage deserved to know the truth. The young wolves, growing up believing they were worthless when they carried noble blood, the families serving others when they should have been leaders themselves, the systematic lies that had shaped generations of lives, all of it needed to be exposed and corrected. As she sat in the archives late one night, surrounded by the evidence of decades of deception, Serena made a decision that would change everything. She would not allow fear to silence her, would not permit the comfortable lies to continue protecting those who had built their power on the suppression of others. Whatever consequences awaited, whatever dangers her bloodline might carry, she would reveal the truth about their pack's hidden history. But as she gathered the documents that would expose the conspiracy, she failed to notice the shadow that detached itself from the darker corners of the archive room. Someone had been watching her investigation, someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment to act. The game that had been played in secret for generations was about to explode into the open, and Serena was about to discover that some truths carried a price higher than she had ever imagined possible. The shadow moved with predatory silence as Serena gathered the damning documents, her hands trembling slightly as she realized the magnitude of what she was about to expose. Generations of lies, decades of suppressed bloodlines, families destroyed to maintain an artificial hierarchy built on fear and control. The weight of truth felt heavier in her hands than all the ancient tomes she had ever carried, each page representing lives that had been systematically destroyed by those who claimed to protect their pack. "I was wondering when you would finally piece it all together," came a voice from the darkness, cultured and calm in a way that made her blood freeze in her veins. Elder Blackwood emerged from the shadows, his aged features twisted into an expression she had never seen before. Cold calculation replacing the grandfatherly warmth he had always shown her. Serena clutched the documents to her chest, her newly awakened senses screaming danger as she realized how vulnerable she was, alone in the archives with someone who had spent decades orchestrating the very conspiracy she had uncovered. The moonlight filtering through the tall windows seemed suddenly dim, as if even the celestial body that governed their kind was reluctant to illuminate what was about to unfold. "You killed them," she whispered, the words falling from her lips like stones as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. "My parents, and all the others whose bloodlines threatened your control. How many murders have you hidden behind convenient accidents over the years?" Elder Blackwood's laugh was dry as autumn leaves, devoid of any warmth or humanity. "Your parents were fools who believed that power should be distributed based on ancient bloodlines rather than proven wisdom. They would have seen our carefully maintained order destroyed in favor of chaos, letting untrained children wield abilities they couldn't possibly understand or control." His words confirmed her worst fears while raising new questions that made her mind reel with their implications. If her parents had been actively working to expose the conspiracy, what had they discovered that made them such a threat? And more importantly, what abilities had they possessed that their enemies had found so dangerous they were willing to commit murder to prevent their inheritance? "The powers in your bloodline," he continued, circling her slowly like a predator toying with wounded prey, "are not gifts, child. They are curses that have brought nothing but destruction whenever they have been allowed to manifest freely. Your ancestors nearly destroyed our entire pack 3 centuries ago when they tried to reshape our society according to their own vision of justice." The revelation hit her like a physical blow as she realized that her research had only revealed part of the truth. Yes, bloodlines had been suppressed, but perhaps there had been valid reasons beyond simple political ambition. If her ancestors had actually used their abilities to cause harm, then maybe the conspiracy had been born from necessity rather than greed. "Show me," she demanded, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice despite the terror coursing through her veins. "If my bloodline is so dangerous, show me exactly what my ancestors did that justified generations of murder and deception." Elder Blackwood's eyes gleamed with something that might have been respect as he gestured toward a section of the archives she had never been allowed to access. Hidden behind a false wall that swung open at his touch, a secret chamber revealed itself, lined with books and scrolls that seemed to pulse with their own inner darkness. The air inside felt thick with old magic and older secrets, making her skin crawl as she followed him into the forbidden space. The texts he showed her painted a picture of her bloodline that was both magnificent and terrifying. Her ancestors hadn't just been powerful lunars, they had been revolutionaries who had attempted to use their abilities to completely restructure werewolf society. Their powers had included not just healing and empathy, but the ability to compel obedience from other wolves, to manipulate emotions on a massive scale, and most frightening of all, to sever the bonds that held packs together. They called it liberation, Elder Blackwood explained, his voice heavy with old grief and older fear. Breaking down the hierarchies that they claimed oppressed the common wolves. But what they created was chaos, packs turning on themselves, families destroyed as bonds of loyalty and love were severed without thought for the consequences. The historical accounts made Serena's stomach turn as she read descriptions of the carnage her ancestors had wrought in their quest for what they had believed was justice. Entire communities had been torn apart as the fundamental connections that held werewolf society together were systematically destroyed. The death toll had been staggering, not from direct violence, but from the psychological and spiritual devastation that followed the collapse of pack bonds. The surviving leaders made a pact, he continued, watching her face carefully as she absorbed the horrific truth. Never again would such powers be allowed to manifest unchecked. The bloodlines were scattered, hidden, their children raised without knowledge of their heritage, so that the abilities would remain dormant. It wasn't cruelty, Serena. It was survival. But even as she struggled with the moral implications of what she was learning, another part of her mind was analyzing the situation with the sharp intellect that had made her such an effective researcher. Something about Elder Blackwood's explanation didn't ring entirely true, and she found herself questioning not just the history he was revealing, but the motives behind his decision to reveal it now. If the suppression was really about protecting the pack, she said slowly, then why did you allow Darius to choose me as Luna? Why risk awakening abilities that you've spent centuries keeping dormant? The elder's confident expression flickered for just a moment, and in that brief hesitation, she saw the truth that he had been trying to hide. The choice hadn't been about protecting anyone at all. It had been about control, about using her awakening powers for purposes that served his agenda, rather than allowing them to develop naturally. You needed a Luna who would be powerful enough to handle what's coming, she continued, pieces falling into place with terrifying clarity, but controllable enough that you could direct how that power was used. You thought my ignorance of my heritage would make me malleable, that you could shape me into the weapon you needed without me understanding what you were doing. Elder Blackwood's mask slipped entirely, revealing the calculating mind that had orchestrated decades of manipulation and murder. The rival packs are uniting, he admitted, his voice taking on an urgent quality that made her blood run cold. Our traditional methods of diplomacy and territorial defense are no longer sufficient. We need a Luna who can do what your ancestors did, but under proper guidance and control. The revelation that their pack was facing an existential threat that required the very powers that had been systematically suppressed for generations created a horrible irony that wasn't lost on her. The abilities that had been deemed too dangerous to allow were now being seen as necessary for survival, but only if they could be wielded by someone who would follow orders without question. What you don't understand, she said, feeling power building within her as her anger grew, is that I'm not the helpless tool you thought you were creating. My research has taught me exactly what I'm capable of, and my bond with Darius has shown me how to use these abilities responsibly. She could feel the change happening within her as emotions she had been suppressing for weeks finally found their outlet. The hurt of betrayal, the rage at the injustices she had uncovered, the determination to protect her pack from those who would manipulate them all combined into something that made the very air around her shimmer with power. Elder Blackwood took a step backward, his confident demeanor cracking, as he realized that his carefully laid plans were unraveling. You don't know what you're doing, he warned, but his voice carried more fear than authority now. Those powers have a will of their own. Once you start using them, you won't be able to control where they lead. Then I'll learn to control them, she replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. But I'll do it my way, not according to some centuries-old plan designed by men who thought murder was an acceptable price for maintaining their version of order. The confrontation might have escalated into violence, but the sound of running footsteps echoing through the archives interrupted them. Darius burst into the secret chamber, his golden eyes blazing with protective fury as he took in the scene before him. Behind him came Marcus and several other young wolves, all of them showing signs of the rushed transformation that indicated they had sensed their Luna was in danger. "Step away from her," Darius commanded, his alpha authority rolling through the chamber like a physical force. But Serena could sense something else in his presence, a knowledge that suggested he had been aware of more than he had revealed. "You knew," she said, turning to face her mate with a mixture of accusation and hurt, "about the conspiracy, about my bloodline, about what Elder Blackwood was planning. You knew all of it." Darius's expression was pained but resolute as he nodded slowly. "I suspected much of it, and I've been investigating the rest since our bonding ceremony. The deeper connection we formed that night showed me memories and knowledge that you weren't even aware you possessed. The revelation that even her mate had been keeping secrets from her should have been devastating, but instead, she found herself oddly relieved. If Darius had known about the dangers and chosen her anyway, it meant that he believed she could handle the truth and the responsibilities that came with it. The rival packs aren't just uniting," Darius continued, his voice heavy with the weight of burdens he had been carrying alone. "They've found their own descendants of suppressed bloodlines, wolves who have been raised specifically to use their powers as weapons against established pack structures. If we don't respond with equal force, our entire way of life will be destroyed." The scope of the conflict suddenly became clear to Serena as she realized that their pack's conspiracy was just one part of a much larger pattern playing out across the supernatural world. Bloodlines that had been hidden for centuries were awakening simultaneously, and the resulting power vacuum was creating opportunities for those who would use ancient abilities for conquest rather than protection. "Then we'll face them together," she said, looking around at the young wolves who had come to her aid, seeing in their faces the same determination that she felt building within herself. "But we'll do it as a united pack, not as manipulators and victims. Everyone deserves to know the truth about their heritage, about the powers they carry, about the choices that have been made in their names." Elder Blackwood made one last desperate attempt to maintain control, reaching for something hidden within his robes, but Marcus was faster. The young wolf, whose own suppressed bloodline was beginning to manifest in enhanced speed and reflexes, disarmed the elder before he could complete whatever action he had planned. The final confrontation was almost anticlimactic, as Elder Blackwood, stripped of his secrets and his supporters, was forced to face the consequences of generations of manipulation and murder. But Serena found that revenge held less satisfaction than she had expected. Instead, she felt only a deep sadness for the opportunities that had been lost, the lives that had been wasted, the potential that had been deliberately destroyed. In the weeks that followed, the revelation of the conspiracy sent shockwaves through their pack as families discovered their true heritage and young wolves began manifesting abilities they had never dreamed they possessed. The process was chaotic and sometimes dangerous, but it was also filled with a sense of renewal and hope that their community hadn't experienced in generations. Serena threw herself into the work of helping newly awakened wolves understand and control their abilities, using the knowledge she had gained from her research and the wisdom she was still developing through her own growing powers. The scared librarian who had fallen down the ceremonial steps was gone, replaced by a Luna who had earned her position through courage, intelligence, and an unshakable commitment to truth. Her relationship with Darius deepened as they worked together to prepare their pack for the challenges that lay ahead. Their bond strengthened by shared purpose and mutual respect. The political marriage that everyone had expected became something far more precious as they discovered that their partnership was based on complementary strengths rather than convenient necessity. But perhaps most importantly, Serena learned that true power didn't come from ancient bloodlines or suppressed abilities, but from the courage to stand up for what was right, even when the cost was higher than anyone should have to pay. As she stood before her pack on the anniversary of her humiliating fall, addressing wolves who now knew the truth about their heritage and their future, she realized that sometimes the greatest transformations began with the most devastating failures. The Luna nobody expected had become exactly the leader they needed, not because of the power she had inherited, but because of the character she had chosen to develop. And as threats gathered on the horizon and other packs prepared for war, she knew that whatever came next, her people would face it united, honest, and stronger than they had ever been before.